The moment my son tore through the shiny Christmas paper, his tiny fingers trembling with excitement, my mother smiled. That sharp, knowing smile she reserved for when she thought she'd won. When he lifted the lid and found nothing inside, her laughter cut through the room like the crack of ice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel in tone. But it was deliberate, and that made it worse. My 5-year-old son Noah froze. His little hands still clutched the empty box, as if he had missed the real gift hidden somewhere beneath the folds of wrapping paper. His brown eyes, full of wonder just seconds ago, flickered with confusion, then disbelief, and finally the kind of hurt that made my heart ache in ways I didn't know were possible. The room fell silent. My siblings, seated neatly around the long mahogany table, shifted in their seats. Their designer clothes shimmered under the chandelier's light, but none of them dared to meet my eyes. My father, Gregory, swirled his scotch lazily in his glass, pretending to admire the fire in the marble hearth. And my mother, Margaret Calloway, tilted her head, that same smirk dancing at the corners of her red-painted lips. "Oh, don't look at me like that, Isabella," she said softly, adjusting the pearl necklace resting against her cream cashmere sweater. "He doesn't need anything. Besides, it builds character." A cold, dark rage unfurled in my chest. Noah blinked rapidly, trying to fight back tears. My husband, Ryan, sat rigid beside me, his jaw so tight I could almost hear his teeth grind. Beneath the table, I curled my fists until my nails bit into my palms. Every muscle in me screamed to move, to leap across the table, to make her understand the cruelty of what she'd done. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled, a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Thank you, Mother," I said evenly, rising from my chair with deliberate calm. I scooped Noah into my arms and pressed a kiss against his forehead. "Come on, sweetheart." Ryan followed in silence, his anger simmering in every measured step. Behind us, my siblings, Claire, Julian, and Mason, avoided my gaze. The grand piano in the corner kept playing, its soft melody now mocking, its notes hollow. As I stepped out into the freezing December air, the snow began to fall again, slow, steady, and silent. I held my son close, his small head resting against my shoulder, and I made a promise. They would pay for this. By the time I was done, my parents, the illustrious Calloways, would learn the hard way that when you humiliate a child, you destroy more than pride. You destroy blood. 3 days earlier, snowflakes had drifted gently outside the windows of our small colonial home. Inside, the air was filled with warmth and the smell of cinnamon and cocoa. Our Christmas tree wasn't grand, but it was alive with handmade ornaments and twinkling lights that Noah had hung himself. He sat cross-legged on the carpet, wrapping a small box with clumsy precision. "Do you think Grandma and Grandpa will like it?" he asked, holding up his creation, a hand-painted ornament he'd made at school, decorated with gold stars and his name written in crooked letters. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile I didn't quite feel. "They'll love it." But even as the words left my mouth, doubt flickered in my chest. He hesitated. "Do we have to go?" That simple question gutted me. It wasn't the first time he'd asked. Over the past few months, Noah had begun to notice things. Things a child should never have to notice. The way my mother brushed past him without a glance. The way my father never spoke to him unless correcting something trivial. How his cousins received extravagant gifts, endless affection and praise, while he got silence. He was only 5, but he had already learned what rejection looked like. I knelt beside him, cupping his small face in my hands. "I know it's not always fun, but Christmas is about family. No matter what happens, Daddy and I will always be right there, okay?" He nodded slowly, but the excitement had dimmed in his eyes. Behind me, Ryan appeared in the doorway, adjusting his navy sweater. "We don't have to go, Izzy," he said quietly. "Not if it's going to hurt him again." "I wish it were that simple," I whispered. "If we skip, she'll make sure it hurts us twice as bad next time." He sighed, raking a hand through his hair. We'd had this conversation before, too many times. For years, I had played the dutiful daughter, swallowing their remarks, their cold smiles, their endless criticisms of my husband. Because deep down, I still hoped they'd change. I still hoped that one day they'd see Noah and love him the way they loved the others. But after this Christmas, I would finally understand. People like my parents don't change. They just polish their cruelty until it looks like class. The Calloway estate loomed ahead like a monument to old money and empty hearts. The Victorian mansion stood tall and silent against the snowy landscape, its iron gates gleaming beneath golden lanterns. As we pulled into the driveway, my chest tightened. Claire's SUV was already parked near the entrance. Of course she'd come early, always eager to impress our mother. Inside, laughter and music floated through the frosted windows. Noah fidgeted in his seat. "Does Santa come to Grandma's house too?" he asked softly. Ryan reached over, giving his shoulder a squeeze. "Santa goes wherever you are, buddy. And no matter what happens tonight, you've got us. That's all that matters." I smiled at him in the rearview mirror, though it felt hollow. "He's right," I whispered. When we stepped out, the wind bit at our faces. I took Noah's hand and climbed the front steps. My fingers hovered over the doorknob, the weight of years of history pressing down on me. Then I pushed it open. Warmth, light, and the scent of roasted turkey enveloped us. The foyer gleamed with marble floors, a grand staircase sweeping upward, and a chandelier glittering like a frozen waterfall. At the center stood my mother's pride, a 12-foot Christmas tree, decorated in gold and crystal, cold and perfect. "You finally made it," Margaret said, gliding toward me. She kissed my cheek, a gesture as empty as her heart. Her perfume was sharp and suffocating. "Traffic?" "Something like that," I replied. Her eyes flicked to Ryan, but never softened. Then, from the next room, my father's booming voice filled the air. "Merry Christmas, Isabella." He never used my married name. Noah's grip on my hand tightened. I squeezed back gently, forcing a smile. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered. "Mom and Dad are just old-fashioned." But even as I said it, something deep inside me whispered that this would be the last time I'd ever make excuses for them. The night unfolded with a hollow rhythm of polite conversation and forced laughter. The table gleamed with crystal glasses and silver cutlery, the air thick with false cheer. Noah sat quietly beside me, his legs dangling from the high-backed chair. Across the table, my mother's gaze flitted from one grandchild to another, showering each with compliments. When Noah tried to speak, to tell them about his school project, Margaret raised a manicured hand. "Let's save the children's chatter for later," she said smoothly, turning instead to Julian's son, who was bragging about his new chess trophy. Noah's small face flushed crimson. I bit the inside of my cheek, tasting blood. Ryan's hand brushed mine under the table, a silent warning. "Not yet." I nodded faintly. Not yet, but soon. Very soon. Dinner dragged on like a play no one wanted to watch. The kind where everyone already knew their lines, yet still pretended the ending might somehow change. The chandeliers glowed softly above us, casting golden halos across crystal glasses and polished silverware. Laughter came easily for everyone else, too easily. It was the kind of laughter that existed only to fill the silence between lies. My mother presided over it all like a queen, chin high, eyes sharp. Across the table, my siblings basked in her approval. Claire, the eldest, always poised, always perfect. Julian, who turned every sentence into a humble brag. Mason, the youngest, forever the golden boy. And me? I was the afterthought. The daughter who had married below her station, who had traded pedigree for love. Noah sat between Ryan and me, poking quietly at his mashed potatoes while his cousins bragged about ski trips and ponies and gaming consoles. When he tried to join in, to mention his handmade ornament, no one listened. I reached under the table and took his hand. It was small and trembling. He didn't look at me, just whispered, "Can we go home soon?" "Soon," I whispered back. But not yet. When the plates were cleared, the real show began. The gift exchange, my mother's favorite performance of the night. Servants carried in piles of glittering presents, each wrapped in gold and red ribbon, each tagged with perfect calligraphy. Claire's twins squealed as they opened new gaming consoles. Julian's son beamed over a premium telescope. Mason's little girl received a diamond-studded charm bracelet, from Grandma, of course. Margaret's gaze swept over the room, soaking in every gasp of delight, every chorus of "thank you." Each expression of gratitude fed her ego like fine wine. Then came Noah's turn. My mother handed him a small box. Her tone was light, careless. "Here you go, dear." Noah's eyes widened. He looked up at me, smiling with hope so pure it almost hurt to see. He carefully peeled away the glossy paper, lifting the lid with shaking hands. Silence. His smile faltered. His fingers touched the bottom of the box, empty. For a second, he thought he had missed something. He looked inside again. Then his gaze lifted. And Margaret laughed. Not a booming laugh, but a delicate, musical one. The kind that made people around her laugh too, even when they didn't understand the joke. "Oh, come now," she said, waving one hand dismissively. "He doesn't need more toys. It'll build character." The room froze. Noah's eyes filled with tears he refused to shed. His tiny hands clutched the box like it might still give him something if he held it tightly enough. His lower lip trembled, but he stayed quiet. My brave little boy. I heard Ryan inhale sharply beside me. I knew that sound. He was seconds away from exploding. His hands were clenched so tightly the tendons in his wrists stood out like cords. I touched his arm, just once. Not yet. Then I turned to my mother. "Thank you, Mother," I said softly. "You've given us exactly what we needed tonight." Something flickered behind her eyes, a crack in her composure, but she smiled anyway. "Oh, I'm sure I have." And with that, I stood, lifting Noah into my arms. I pressed my lips to his hair and whispered, "We're leaving." The room stayed silent as I walked out. Not one word, not one apology. Only the faint hum of the grand piano followed us down the long hallway. Outside, the cold slapped against my face. The snow fell heavier now, muffling the world around us. Ryan carried the bags without a word, his anger coiled tight. When I strapped Noah into his seat, he looked up at me, voice trembling. "Did I do something bad?" The words tore through me. "No, sweetheart," I whispered. "You did nothing wrong." He sniffled and leaned against the seatbelt, exhausted from the night. Ryan started the car, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "She's sick," he muttered. "Your mother is actually sick." I stared through the windshield, my reflection merging with the lights of that perfect mansion behind us. "Let her be," I said quietly. "For now." The next morning, the world outside was white and silent, but inside our home, the air was heavy. I stood in the kitchen, watching the snow sparkle beneath the sunrise. The coffee in my mug had long gone cold. I hadn't slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Noah's face, that crushed, quiet confusion that no child should ever wear. The sound of small footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. Noah stood in the doorway, wearing his red sweater. It looked too big on him now. "Did Santa still come?" he asked softly. Ryan walked in behind him, setting a hand on his shoulder. "Santa always comes, buddy." But his voice broke slightly on the last word. The phone buzzed on the counter, startling me. The name on the screen, Claire. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" Her voice came through, tense and fast. "Isabella, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about last night. I should have said something." I almost laughed. "But you didn't." A pause, then softly, "You're right, I didn't. None of us did. We just sat there like cowards." "Because it was easier," I said flatly. "Yes," she admitted, "but this time it went too far. Julian, Mason, and I talked this morning. We've had enough." I frowned. "Enough of what?" "Of them," she said. "Of Mom and Dad. The way they control everything, our lives, our money, our reputations, and still find new ways to belittle us. You're not the only one they've broken down over the years. We've just hidden it better." Her tone hardened. "We're cutting them off." For a second, I didn't believe her. My siblings had spent years competing for my parents' approval. Claire especially. She lived for it. But her voice didn't waver. "They rely on us," she continued. "On Julian's investments, on Mason's company shares, on the trust fund payments I've been quietly supplementing to keep them in that damn mansion. We've been paying for their luxury while they treat us like children." She paused. "Not anymore. We're done." A strange, cold calm washed over me. "What are you saying, Claire?" "I'm saying we're pulling every string that holds them up," she said, "and I want you in on it." My pulse quickened. I could almost see it. The empire my parents had built on arrogance and illusion starting to crumble. "What do you need me to do?" I asked. By noon, the plan was already in motion. Claire called their private doctor, her voice smooth with rehearsed regret. I'm afraid I won't be covering their medical transportation anymore, she said. They'll need to arrange their own. Julian contacted the property manager. My parents will no longer require maintenance on their estate. Consider the account closed. Mason handled the finances, quietly pulling back every joint investment, severing access to funds they had grown far too comfortable spending. And me? I made one last call. To the country club of Ashton Hills, the crown jewel of my mother's social life. I'd like to cancel the automatic payments for the Callaway membership, I said politely. The woman on the other end hesitated. Mrs. Callaway has been a valued member for over 20 years. Are you sure? I'm sure, I replied. Effective immediately. Click. And just like that, the first stone fell. The fallout came faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, the empire began to crack. My mother's phone calls went unanswered. Her invitations were quietly declined. Friends who once clung to her every word began to distance themselves. At church, whispers replaced greetings. At her favorite boutique, her credit line was declined for the first time in years. My father fared no better. Without Mason managing their accounts, his financial genius evaporated overnight. Bad investments piled up. Stocks plummeted. Suddenly, there were overdue bills. Real ones. But the worst blow came a week later, when the country club membership officially expired. Margaret Callaway, once the reigning queen of Ashton Hills, showed up uninvited, demanding entry. When the receptionist told her the account had been closed, she laughed it off, certain there had been a mistake. There wasn't. For the first time, someone said no to her, and meant it. From that moment on, everything changed. Claire called me that night. She's furious, she said, unable to hide a small laugh. I almost feel bad. Don't, I said. She earned every ounce of this. You think she's learned her lesson? I looked out the window, watching the snow fall outside our warm, modest home. Noah was on the floor, drawing a picture of our family, just the three of us, smiling. No, I said softly. Not yet. Because I wasn't done, not even close. The humiliation she gave my son wasn't just a cruel prank. It was an attack on his worth, and I intended to make her feel that same hollow emptiness she had given him. I had a plan. And this time, it wouldn't just hurt her pride. It would destroy everything she valued. The days that followed felt like watching a long, exquisite painting peel off the wall. Each flap revealed rotten plaster underneath, the hidden rot that had been carefully concealed by gilt frames and cheerful smiles. My siblings and I watched as the life my parents pretended to own slipped through their fingers, and with every small collapse, my resolve hardened. Margaret's calls transitioned from clipped imperious demands to frantic pleading messages. Claire, this must be a mistake. Reinstate the account, she begged one afternoon, voice brittle with panic. Claire's reply was a cool, rehearsed refusal. We discussed this. Until there's a change in behavior, no more hand-holding. They tried other tactics. My father, humiliated and desperate, reached out to old friends, the kind who once queued at their door to be seen with them. Most of those friends were careful now. Association had become liability. One or two offered sympathetic words, but none reopened doors. Pride, it turns out, is a brittle thing when money and utility are stripped away. The mansion, once humming with hired staff and quiet efficiency, grew quiet in the way of empty rooms, echoes where there had been voices, dust where polish used to gleam. Landscapers stopped turning up after I confirmed the cancellation. The gardener's truck didn't arrive. A leaking gutter in the West Wing turned into a small disaster because no one was tending to minor repairs. An unpaid invoice slipped through the cracks and became a plumber's notice. It was petty, small, and almost ridiculous. But small things add up. They suffocate. And the smallest, cruelest of all blows came when a social calendar they relied on evaporated. Invitations dried up, lunches were declined. People previously eager for proximity shifted seats elsewhere. Margaret, who had once arranged seating charts and charity galas, found herself the guest of awkward silence. She began pacing the halls with a hollow kind of fury, muttering to Gregory about lawyers and options that sounded increasingly like threats made out of habit rather than plan. Through it all, Noah's laughter returned. He rebuilt his wonder over small things. A paper crown we made together, the glitter of leftover ornaments, a cup of hot chocolate with too much whipped cream. He began to fill the house with small drawings, Suns with uneven rays, stick family members holding hands. Each picture was a quiet victory, but I wasn't finished. The humiliation of that empty box demanded more than social exile. It demanded that Margaret understand the depth of what she'd taken from a child. I wanted her to feel the brittle loneliness she'd dressed in pearls and called elegance. I wanted the Callaway name, so long used as a club to swing at others, to taste its own medicine, irrelevance. That winter, a legal wrinkle presented itself. My parents' trust documents were overdue for a review. Margaret had been careless in the past decade, trusting estate management to others, to her children. The paperwork sat in an attorney's office, a file that required signatures and confirmations. Julian and Claire, sensing an opportunity for permanence, quietly refused to sign amendments that would have guaranteed discretionary payments for my parents' lifestyle. Without those extensions, automatic transfers faltered at a critical moment. Small overdrafts accumulated into formal notices. I watched as Gregory's confident speeches about legacy grew anxious. Without funds, his pronouncements sounded thin. He began to call old acquaintances, the type who once swallowed his barbs with a smile. Now, calls went unanswered. Then a rumor circulated, not malicious in origin, but inevitable in consequence. A document leak, a rumor that the Callaway endowment had been restructured, that control had shifted. Fund managers began to ask questions. Call logs were scrutinized. People who had once benefited from the family's veneer of stability now sought clarity. Panic breeds exposure, and exposure breeds consequences. One icy morning, a menacing envelope arrived, a notice of foreclosure on one of the Callaway rental properties. It was a small building in a coastal town, always meant to be more sentimental than profitable. The mortgage company wasn't sentimental. They wanted payments. The trustees had assumed someone would keep it going, until someone didn't. Gregory slammed his fist on the dining table, the sound the house hadn't heard in years. That night, Margaret wept alone in her bedroom, a sound so unpracticed it made the house flinch. And still, for all the dwindling servants and rejected invitations, the hardest moment for them came quietly, at a small, ordinary gathering. A charity luncheon Margaret had planned for months, a centerpiece of her social calendar, was canceled by sponsors when they learned the funding guarantees she'd counted on were gone. Invitations were withdrawn. The ladies who had once leaned on her for advice offered instead polite condolences. She stood in front of the empty ballroom in her best dress and felt finally the chill of diminished relevance. When she called me then, the voice on the line was husky with fear, not fury. "Isabella," she whispered. "Please." "Claire, Julian, tell me what will fix this. I don't know what to do." I thought of Noah, face streaked with tears over a hollow box. I thought of the way he'd trusted that Christmas miracle would arrive at Grandma's house. I thought of the quiet dignity with which he'd accepted shame. My thumb pressed down on the phone's cold frame. "We did what we had to," I said. My voice was steady, not cruel. "You made choices." "You're my daughter," she said, pleading. "You can help us." "I am your daughter," I replied. "But I'm Noah's mother first." I let the line sit, let her hear the silence that had been her favorite weapon. Her panic didn't soften into apology. She clung to threats and lawyers like talismans. But threats bounce off the empty. Lawyers cost money. Time and unscrupulous creditors make threats less meaningful. Desperation begets exposure, and exposure begets ruin. Winter loosened into early spring. The snow melted and revealed the estate's bones. A for sale sign appeared briefly by the stables, a clearance of excess to cover overdue taxes. It felt obscene and perfect in the same moment. The Callaway crest, once a symbol of unquestioned taste, weathered and flaked under drizzle. People asked if I regretted it. There are cheap given answers here, that revenge feels empty, that power corrupts equally, that one should be careful what they wish for. But those aphorisms did not fit in the house where a child's eyes went cold. What I felt in the months after the fall was not triumph so much as relief, and an aching, careful sorrow. Margaret stopped showing up at Sunday services. Gregory's speeches at the club were now interrupted by awkward coughs and polite departures. My siblings took their places in an altered orbit, none cruel, none repentant beyond what convenience required. They visited, once internally chastened, but the warmth between us was never restored to what it had been before their acquiescence to the plan. There were not parades or confessions. There was a slow, brittle thaw. Noah grew. He learned not to measure his worth by other people's wrapping paper. He learned patience and laughter, and that sometimes adults break things that can be mended again. He forgave in the way children do, lightly, quickly, not because everything had been okayed, but because he was built for joy. On the first summer evening when the house felt like ours again, Noah painted another ornament. "For Grandma," he said, smiling shyly. He handed it to me afterward, brown eyes full of a forgiveness I hadn't earned but would accept like sunlight. I walked it to the mailbox and slipped it inside an envelope with a simple note, "For the ornament." From Noah. A week later, a letter arrived. Not the fiery apology I'd imagined, but a small card. "Thank you for the ornament. It is beautiful." It was not a confession. It was not redemption. But it was something. A small acknowledgement is the first step of something larger. Maybe one day Margaret would understand the depth of what she'd done. Maybe she never would. I stopped trying to be the architect of lessons for others. I chose instead to be the keeper of my child's worth. When the dust settled, the Calloway estate remained a shell of its former grandeur. For some, that would be loss. For me, it was liberation. The house we lived in, modest, warm, filled with imperfect laughter, became the place where my son learned to be unbroken. Revenge is not a spectacle. It is a quiet rearrangement of consequences. I had wanted and taken a lesson properly learned. In the space that opened, we planted small, honest things. Custard tarts on a Friday night, ridiculous jokes at breakfast, paper sailboats down the gutter after a rain. Noah's laughter stitched the seams where pride had rent us open. Sometimes I thought about the empty box and the way the room had held its breath. The memory still stung. But it no longer defined us. The last time we drove past the old Calloway gates, Noah waved without looking back. His hand was busy holding Ryan's, busy building a life that could not be measured by pearls or invitations. That, more than any retrenchment or checklist of ruin, felt like victory. And when Margaret looked out her window and saw our small house glowing with lights, the knowledge that her granddaughter, and later, perhaps even her own reconciliation, existed outside her command would be the true undoing of her power. She could rebuild her stately gatherings, she could buy new things, but she could not purchase the spontaneous, ordinary joy of a child held safe. That was the point I'd wanted her to learn. You can strip someone of wealth and invitations, but you can't buy back what you take from a child's heart. Some lessons once taught change the ledger of a life forever.